Hello, I'm Leslie and I'm an art therapist, and I'm here today to talk about grief and the different models of grief. So, if you have if you're going through grief at the moment and you've had a recent bereavement or um, you're going through different experiences, then I'm really sorry for your loss. I'm really sorry for that, and I'm just wanting to kind of like recognize that actually everybody's experience of grief is different. There's no set way to grieve. There's no set way that you have to feel, and that actually taking away some of that pressure to feel a certain way can be quite helpful, but also it can be quite challenging for people because sometimes they feel that, oh, I wonder if I should be feeling a certain way and tell me what to do and sort of thing. So I wanted to kind of recognize that first of all, and then think a little bit about some of the different models of grieving. So first of all, we have a model called growing around grief. So this implies that your grief doesn't necessarily change and get smaller over time, but over time, your life then expands. So imagine this is your life here. This is you and your life and everything that you're doing in your life. It might be that you've got certain things going on. And then what happens when we've had a bereavement, or whether there's been a traumatic incident or something, some loss or something that causes that grief, those feelings, this is what is representing your grief, and this fills up your life. We literally filled up your life. There's very little room for anything else. And in that stage of grief, it can feel like there's nothing else that you can really think and feel about. It can feel like enormous. And rather than the grief shrinking over time and your life staying the same, what the growing around grief model looks at is the idea of your life expanding. So we've got a new pot. Gradually over time, you start to do different things. You start to watch a new TV program. You start to go for a walk. You start to join clubs. You might buy a new item of clothes. You might go on holiday, for instance. You might do different things, and you might take up a hobby. You might learn the piano, for instance. And this sort of thing applies for children and for adults. And that then means that even though the grief is still there, it's very much there, and it can move all around. It can affect all sorts of areas of your life. It might be that you take up a new hobby, and then suddenly in the middle of the gym, then you suddenly remember that person, or like the feelings come up. So it doesn't necessarily mean that it stays in one place, but your life then gets bigger. So then what then continues is your life gets even bigger. So with this theory, once again, the grief stays the same. It might be that there are further things. There might be new people in your life, or it might be that you had a career change, for instance, or it might be that you've started to learn a new language, and your life is just getting bigger, surrounded by that. And that essentially is what the growing around grief process talks about. Sometimes people use an analogy of a fried egg, where you've got the egg yolk as the grief, and then the egg white as as the life, and it being expanded and like it being quite different. And sometimes actually, if you're thinking about that, then grief might feel like a scrambled egg. It might feel like an omelette, or it might feel kind of more messy. It might not feel quite so kind of compact and so clear as the egg yolk and the egg white. It might be more messy than that. But equally, it might be that the egg is then made into a cake, and some kind of like moments of joy come up from moments of kind of special memories. So that's the growing around grief process. The next model that we've got is talking about a model called dual process model. So what this talks about is how we have different things going on. So the experience and maybe the task of feeling sad and like feeling enormously sad and kind of distress and lots of feelings. There may be feelings of anger, there may be feelings of resentment, there may be feelings of like frustration and loss and all those kind of things, lots and lots of fears, lots and lots of things like that. And that's when maybe thinking and remembering that person and really like being within that space and being able to kind of recognize that. And there's moments when that would be happening. And I'm going to use one of these scourers to represent that moment when we're really kind of focusing on the grief. And then times when we may focus on restoring your life, doing something different in life. That might be similar to what we did with the other one, stepping into like a new hobby, being courageous, starting to kind of do something for yourself and starting to kind of imagine life without that person and like mourning the loss. And sometimes what happens with the dual process is that we are bouncing in and out of that. So sometimes life is about focusing on the grief. Sometimes life is about focusing on the future. Sometimes life is about the grief, life is about the future. Sometimes it's happening together and it's a whole big mix and scramble. And that's okay. Because as I said at the beginning of this video, there is no set way that you grieve. There's no like book to read to kind of do it right or to do it wrong. And whatever you're doing, then it's absolutely fine. But these are some of the theories and some of the ideas about that. So one other theory that we talk about a lot is a theory of continuing bonds. So once again, this is like if we were to think about having maybe an invisible thread. We've got a charger here, an invisible. In fact, a charger could be a good way of thinking about it. An invisible thread. So having that connection, this is obviously visible, but having that connection with that person. So it might be that certain hobbies and interests that you have and certain things that you have and certain things that you kind of continue to do that person liked to do. So it might be that person that's died was really into football, and so actually every time you go and watch football you might remember them. It might be that, for example, like when my granddad died, I remember the funeral. He was really into gardening, and he died 15 years ago now, but a lot of the time even now, the funeral we all wore green because he was so into gardening. He had such green fingers and it was really important to be able to recognize that. And it was something that made me and my siblings and my dad and other people feel closer to him. And actually, I'm not even sure whether my dad wore green, but me and my sister certainly wore green. And now when I'm doing my gardening, whilst I don't have a big interest in gardening myself, I do think about my granddad when I'm doing the gardening, when I'm doing the weeds and things like that. And so that becomes that continuous bond, that I will always have that bond with my granddad. And I think there was something about like cooking Sunday dinners and like those kind of memories. And if I was to cook like sprouts, for instance, and I have a joke about sprouts being overly cooked, that they're the kind of things that allow for that continuing bond. And they're thinking about the memories. And sometimes when you think about a memory of someone that's no longer here, it can make you feel really sad. It can feel like very anxiety inducing, really overwhelming and too much. And that you might need to step out of that and do something else. But then other times it might be that looking at a memory box and looking at a photo album and looking at things that represent that person can provide some comfort. So actually, there's something really important about recognizing what's helpful for you in that moment and what feels not helpful. And sometimes we have to do the opposite thing to what feels comfortable to do. And that actually, a lot of the experiences of grief and bereavement are hard. It's like we can't take away how difficult that is. But actually, my intention of making this video was to be able to make something that was quite a little bit reflective, but also a way of showing some of these ideas in a visual way. So, like, just to recap, we've got the growing around grief idea where we're building up. Life becomes bigger. The grief doesn't get smaller, but life becomes bigger. And then we've got the dual process model where we're focusing on one thing or focusing on another thing, and we bounce between the two. So when it comes to children, this is often called puddle jumping. So if a child has been bereaved, then sometimes it can appear that they are just getting on with life and like playing, doing different things. They might just be, or they, and then they'll be really sad the next minute, or they may be really upset and then just 2 seconds later just ask what's for tea. And that's a way of coping. That's essentially a way of being able to cope through that and to be able to think about like how to function. How on earth might you be functioning after the loss of that person? And sometimes it can just be about being protective and that survival thing and feeling safe enough to express themselves. So hope that helped. I'm a bereavement worker as well as an art therapist in my job at the moment. And in my work as an art therapist, I work with people where there's lots of different losses. And sometimes the grief doesn't necessarily represent somebody that's died and a bereavement, but it can represent a separation from somebody, or it can represent a loss of how your life might have been. So a loss of like an illness can cause a sense of grief, or changes in circumstances. For instance, like this year I had a hysterectomy, and whilst I didn't have any direct plans to have children, I didn't have children before my hysterectomy. I was really surprised and really quite shocked that I was feeling the grief of not having any children and not being able to have any children, and that my life was very different, and that having a hysterectomy made it a permanent thing. So actually, it's very different from a bereavement, but a trauma or something like that can actually cause us to feel that loss. So if you're experiencing a big feeling, then some of these models could apply to you, where you jump in and out of feeling that and allowing yourself to feel the emotions whilst also expanding your life more so that it doesn't just take over. So thanks so much for watching and take care. Bye bye.